The one supreme right that all governments reserve for themselves globally is the monopoly on violence. Now, that might sound strange when looking at the recent riots that have come to regularly plague the United States and its mutually hostile populace. But I think it is this profound lack of understanding of violence, its meaning within a social context, as well as when first applied to persuade, but then on a scale of escalation for one group of people to force their dominance over another group. And for the purposes of this video, it's very telling that when it comes to political aims, communists, Marxists, and the Maoist left highlight and demonstrate time and time again that the political center and right completely lack this understanding about the true nature of violence. And this can be seen from nation-state to nation-state war, all the way down to online censorship. Before this video begins, I would like to encourage new viewers to subscribe to this channel, but more importantly, for returning viewers, please check that you're still subscribed, as I've received thousands of messages from people that have been unsubscribed by YouTube without their knowledge or consent. That said, thanks for arriving via whichever way, and let's get started. Humans coercing other humans seems to be at the heart of what our species does. It's the level of that coercion that some try and draw a line at, but the only thing that this demonstrates, this demarcation line, if you will, is their lack of understanding about the nature of coercion and the force behind it. Currently, at the moment, American cities are yet again exploding into a frenzy of riots and looting. This is being fed by the media narrative that always accentuates interracial police brutality in order to drive ratings. To be sure, the senseless death of Mr. George Floyd in Minneapolis was senseless and tragic. But as this is an unfolding story, we do need to reserve judgment so far. The one thing we can know, however, is that the media is driving this wedge between Americans for profit. The reason this is very clear is that when police brutality is intra-racial, as was the case back in January 2016 when Officer Philip Mitchell Brailsford gunned down in cold blood 26-year-old Daniel Shraver in a hallway outside of his hotel room in Arizona as he was forced to crawl along the floor, crying and begging for his life. His pleas for his life did him no good, and he was murdered. And while the officer did lose his job, he wasn't jailed for this senseless act of brutality. In fact, he was temporarily rehired by his department last year so that he could apply for an accidental disability pension. Yes, that's right, a pension that is tax-free, worth $31,000 for life, that he will now have as he claims PTSD for gunning down Daniel Shraver.
Guys, I just wanted to make a quick video because I just need to share my frustrations. As you guys know, my husband was killed a few weeks ago while traveling for work in Arizona. And he was a really good dad. He was a hard worker and my best friend. It's really hard and frustrating because his story isn't being shared that much. It is by my friends, so I don't want you guys to think that I don't appreciate that. I do. But it's frustrating because he was white and because he was just a young guy and he doesn't have, disabilities or, all these things that other stories are being shared, that it doesn't matter. Because his life didn't matter too. He was my husband and my kid's father, and it definitely matters to us. And now all that's left of him is this.
Put simply, police brutality is wrong, no matter who it targets. There are bad apples, but they are not the majority, as there are also very many good police officers. In fact, a study back in 2016 indicated that officers were slower to shoot armed black suspects than white armed suspects, and they were less likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than unarmed white suspects. These findings challenge the assumption that implicit racial bias affects police behavior in deadly encounters with black suspects. But this kind of information doesn't fit into the corporate-controlled mainstream media and their 24-hour news cycle driven by outrage and cultural narratives. And this is why you will see riots, violence, looting, and burning when the news cycle hypes the interracial instances of police brutality while simply paying lip service to intra-racial police brutality. Both are wrong. But do not misunderstand what the police are, how they operate, and what they are working toward. What can be gleaned from something as simple as a jaywalking ticket all the way up to the slow death of a man lying in the road with a knee in his neck is that any citizen that interferes with these representatives of the state can see their own life forfeit. And for that reason, most sane people understand that the police represent the government's monopoly on violence, and that to even try and interfere with the killing of a fellow citizen like Mr. George Floyd could find bystanders losing their lives for challenging that authority. And it is that authority, the authority of the state and their monopoly on violence that is represented by the police, is the reason they are not penalized even when circumstances do not support their representation of events. And thus, the vast majority of people seem to understand that this government is sanctioned to escalate violence. It starts with economics that deprive you of your wealth, moves on to incarceration that deprives you of your freedom, and finally, executions that deprive you of your life. As said, most people understand this spectrum of violence as it is employed by the state. What's more interesting, however, is the total lack of understanding when it comes to the escalation of political violence by centrists and those on the right. And this is in stark contrast with Marxists, Maoists, and their foot soldiers in groups like Antifa, that while rarely move to deprive people of their lives, as this would cross the line and invites the state to adjudicate on behalf of their victims, but they are experts on depriving their opponents of their wealth and liberty. However, first off, to understand is this: peace is not the normal default for human beings. Struggle and strife are. And this can come within a broad spectrum, from PTA meetings on what books to include in curriculum to full-on wars between nations. Conflict, in fact, is our species' natural predisposition. And from my observations, it would appear to me that those on the center, as well as the center-right, but also center-left, in fact, are generally honest people. And to them, you are either violent toward a person or an institution, or you are peaceful. And most are looking at avoiding conflict at all cost. And the reason for that is conflict has a cost in our society, and that's usually economic. Thus, anything that has the potential to upset the affluence that peace provides, well, those people will try to avoid it and do so with great vigor, even if those that spur on the chaos are repugnant to this group. But be that as it may, and most critically, this group of people, The center, center right, and center left do not seem to understand the use or levels of violence outside of the government-citizen binary. However, leftists, Maoists, and their ilk understand that there is a full spectrum of violence to be applied to reduce the resistance of an adversary and pummel them into submission.
I can't do an interview with you until you contact my press liaison.
You look like milk. You look so weak. You know what you look like? Someone has a glass of water and they just put in like 4 drops of milk. You just seem to have this sort of sad acquiescence to you. You just look like you could just spill all over the ground. Are you gay? I used to know this. I'm so unhomophobic that I forgot.
Listen, man, we're done.
We're done? All right, where are you going?
For an example of this spectrum, it begins with blogs like Right Wing Watch that is funded by billionaire George Soros and its single activist pretending to be journalist Jared Holt is solely in the business of canceling people that he and his fellow Maoists see as advocates against their particular brand of fanaticism. Other such groups like Rational Wiki, among others, use the threat of economic violence by smearing, deplatforming, as was the case with Gavin McInnes and Alex Jones, for example, by using defamation and lies to try and impoverish their ideological opponents by attempting to deprive them of employment or business opportunities. And this is the economic spectrum that is used masterfully by the far left. Moving along this axis, there are the petty acts of vandalism, smash and run as it were. Don't want to bake a cake? Watch your shop be attacked again and again and again. This is a form of economic terrorism that you can wage against non-compliant people or institutions. Do it once and you'll anger them. Do it a dozen times and eventually people will only comply with or attempt to appease the leftists that are committing this terrorism against them. And in a sense, this form of economic terrorism works very well. Along this spectrum, there is also the instance of, let's say, someone that is just trying to protest for his right to speak. But freedom of speech terrifies your run-of-the-mill 21st century Maoist just as much as it did your 20th century far-left Maoist. Usually, however, they can't just beat someone over the head with a bike lock without repercussions, but then again, sometimes they can. But in most instances, all they need to do is to constantly violate the other person's personal space, usually in a group. Standing obnoxiously close to another person, breathing in their face, grabbing their sign or personal property, or bumping into them is usually all it takes, because this makes your average person feel very uncomfortable, because it's quite disconcerting to normal people when this happens, as it is a signal of impending violence when other people do this. And if the harassed party or the hapless man strikes the Maoist in retaliation, well then he goes to jail. But more likely than that, he will just retreat from the situation, and thus the far left has conquered his space. Then there are the street thugs, and this is to step it up a notch, and this is when you get physical attacks on people. And even the fanatics at Antifa, however, understand that it's not a good idea to kill people, as this may not only provoke retaliation, but can also create martyrs. Moreover, leftists, far leftists, understand public relations far, far better than centrists or those on the right do. So they merely beat isolated people while they themselves are in groups, and this is their general modus operandi. Now, get beat up once and you will soldier on, but if it keeps on happening day after day, week after week, they slash your tires, they break your windows, eventually you will leave and you will retreat. Put simply, terrorism works, and terrorism is what the essence of direct action is. And this is why the thugs of Antifa wear masks. While the likes of Activists like Jared Holt and the fanatics at Rational Wiki confine themselves to slander and libel and attempts at economic violence. Antifa are the ones in the trenches and in the business of violence, and this is why they wear masks, so as not to be identified. And this gets back to the current events gripping Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and other cities around the country in terms of the acceptable spectrum of violence that will be tolerated by the authorities. And the African community understands this much better than the white community, as these instances of lawlessness are now routinely tolerated by the authorities. But for the cause, the mob will riot, loot, burn down businesses, but do draw the line at killing cops. Similarly, and unlike the center and right, the far left and Marxists as well as Maoists understand the use of political violence and its spectrum when attacking the economics, the liberty, and physical personage of their opponents without stepping across the line set by the authorities that hold the real monopolization on violence. The difference between these two groups is that African Americans have legitimate grievances that date back hundreds of years. While their methods are questionable and usually self-harming, groups of far-left Marxists and Maoists are just LARPers playing at revolution and moaning about their first world problems in the security blanket of prosperity. Either way, it's important to understand the spectrum of violence employed by the left and the terrorism that they wield to bend people, to coerce people, to force other people to adhere to their will. You cannot resist a thing without understanding a thing. And the far left, as well as their foot soldiers, are masters of the use of the entire spectrum of political violence in 21st century America. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please consider subscribing. Also, make sure that you are still subscribed to this channel, as YouTube unsubscribes thousands of people monthly from channels like this. Also, remember to go over and check out my second channel, Felix Rex. There's a lot more videos on these types of subjects. Link is in the description. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.